Jorge Masvidal takes on Nate Diaz this Saturday at Madison Square Garden on UFC 244 for the BMF belt. This is the battle camp. Please hit the subscribe button. You'll find it in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. So yesterday I watched Ariel Helwani sit down for an hour with Nate Diaz. I watched the Jorge Masvidal fight week conference call. I watched the Nate Diaz fight week conference call. I watched the first episode of Fight Week Embedded. I watched the fucking countdown show for 244. Today, I watched Brett Okamoto walk around Jorge Masvidal's old hood with Jorge Masvidal going down memory lane for 25 minutes. The reason why I consumed all of this digital media is because I have a raging hard-on for this fucking fight. What a fight. And this fight isn't just a fight for me. It represents, if I can say it right, a whole lot more. Let me explain. We're talking about two guys that have been grafting for 15 plus years in this game. We're talking about two guys that have struggled. We're talking about two guys that have had peaks and troughs. We're talking about two guys that have had time away from the fight game. We've had two guys that have been very active in the fight game. We've had two guys that have been constantly fighting top 10 fighters for the last 10 years plus. We're talking about two guys that have more than paid their dues. And now they're finally getting the fruits of their fucking labor. They're finally getting what they deserve. They're finally getting the notoriety. They're finally getting the platform. They're finally getting the fucking money, the purses. They're finally getting the respect of the organization that they fight for. They're finally getting the stage that I feel they've deserved for a number of years. We're talking about two men that have grabbed some of that power that the dictatorship that is the UFC have held on for so long and taken some of that power back. We're talking about two guys that called their shot and took that fucking position. This isn't a fight that came because the UFC wanted it to happen. This isn't a fight that the UFC were right behind from the get-go. Go back on my channel and watch some of my videos that I made about this whole situation and how it came about. We're talking about two guys that called their fucking shot and they left the UFC in no position but to grant them this wish. We're talking about two guys that fucking made up a belt. They made up their own division and left the UFC with no choice but to create a fucking actual belt about it. Like, this fight means so much more than two guys stepping into a cage and knocking the shit out of each other. This is something that me as a hardcore MMA fan, I've been waiting for years for something to happen. Like, the UFC never once got behind any of these guys for the majority of their career. And for me, I think this opportunity that they've taken has been granted by the UFC begrudgingly. I don't think they necessarily wanted this to happen. It just, the movement was just so big and powerful that they didn't have a fucking choice. This is what this fight means to me, and it means the same thing to a lot of other MMA fans that have followed the sport for the number of years that I have. Now, for me, this isn't just a fight for the title of being called the BMF. It's also a fight being contested by two people that I consider to be the RMF, the realest motherfuckers in the game. Because these two guys have never ever done anything, said anything, acted in a way that isn't true to themselves. They've never compromised their own character, their own legitimacy in their own mind. They've never compromised who they are as human beings for fame, for notoriety, for a push in the right direction by the UFC to try and gain a bit of traction or to try and gain a buzz. They've never done that. They've always been real to themselves. They've always said what they feel and what they believe in. They've never really contradicted themselves in interviews. They've never gone one way and then gone the other way. They've never really gone against the UFC and then just done what they wanted them to do anyway. Does that make sense? These guys have always held how they feel about themselves in a higher regard than what the fucking UFC feel about themselves. And for them to be able to main event probably the biggest fight card of the year and take that opportunity rather than wait to be given it, it means a lot. It means a lot for us, the fans, and I'm pretty sure it means a lot for them. The only sad part about all of this is come Saturday night or Sunday morning, depending on where you're watching this fight, one of these guys will probably have lost. All of this momentum that they've built, all of this kind of power that they've harnessed for themselves, they're basically putting it on the line. But I'll tell you one thing, if you ask either of them, I bet you they'd say there isn't anyone else in the roster that they'd rather put that on the line against. Because real recognise real in this situation, and I think they both recognise the struggle in each other. I think they both see the similarities in each other's journeys. And I feel like that the respect that they have for each other will manifest into a fucking great fight. So now that I've got all of that off my chest, let's talk about the actual fight, shall we? Let's start with Nate Diaz. So Nate Diaz's last fight against Pettis in August. So he pretty much done what he does during that fight. But I remember commenting at the time, I feel like he added another string to his bow, because the way he was able to use his physical strength and grapple with Pettis and control Pettis's upper body against the fence, that's something that we haven't really seen him do before. And I feel like in the 3 years he was away, he actually made an improvement. There was no sign of ring rust, and I think that's testament to his mentality and how mentally strong and the toughness he has. And with that being said, I feel like in this situation now, fighting against Jorge Masvidal in a 5-round fight, headlining Madison Square Garden. He's been here before. He's had 2 massive fights against Conor McGregor, and I think that experience is going to hold him in good stead. But just from a physical attributes point of view, I feel like he's genuinely made improvements, and physically he looks a lot stronger. Obviously, he had a run at welterweight previously in his career about 8 years ago or something like that. And I remember at the time when he was fighting, it felt like he just was physically weaker than the other guys. He had the size, the height, and the reach. He just didn't have the physical strength. And I feel like he's grown into an actual welterweight now. And I feel like if this version of Nate Diaz was to fight against those opponents at welterweight, back then, if that makes sense, it may well be a different outcome. I'm not saying that he would definitely win those fights, but what I am saying is he'd have a much better chance of winning those fights. Jorge Masvidal, now he fought Wonderboy Thompson, and this was, hold on, let me check this because I've got his page open, give me a second. So he fought Wonderboy Thompson back in 2017, and he had a layoff. And after that layoff, he came back and he knocked Darren Till out. And then obviously we all know what happened with Ben Askren. Now, I feel like the improvement that Jorge Masvidal has made is not so much a physical or anything in his techniques. Obviously, he's probably improved incrementally up until now. But what I think the major improvement he's made is his mentality, his psyche. I feel like previously he was a bit of a counter fighter and he waited for his opponents to perhaps make mistakes to try and capitalize on them. And I'm going to contradict myself a little bit because that's kind of how he beat Darren Till. But the way he was able to make Darren Till make a mistake was because I feel like he's now just more of an aggressive fighter. He's not waiting for his opponent to do something for him to benefit from. He's trying to create his own openings. I feel like he's just more aggressive, and I feel like that's just more psychological than it is from a physical standpoint. He's just being more aggressive in the fucking cage. Now, when it comes to these two fighting each other, I feel like a good kind of way of looking at this, and obviously this is a bit of a flawed scenario because it's the Donald Cerrone fight. They both fought. They both got a common opponent, Donald Cerrone. Now I know Jorge Masvidal fought him way more recently than what Nate Diaz fought him in, but I feel like the way both of those fights were won is how both of these guys are going to try and win this fight. Let me explain. Nate Diaz beat Donald Cerrone by maintaining his distance, using his reach advantage, boxing his fucking ears off, and basically not being there when a counter strike was thrown by Donald Cerrone, and he just did that for 3 rounds. Jorge Masvidal, he was kind of more reliant on his movement, and he waited for for Donald Cerrone to make a mistake, and which he tried to capitalize on. Now I feel like Jorge Masvidal will be more aggressive in this fight, but part of his game plan or his strategy will be to wait for Nate Diaz, or slip a punch and wait for Nate Diaz to overextend himself and then try and capitalize on it. Where I feel like this fight is going to be won for Jorge Masvidal is if he's able to actually physically hurt Nate Diaz, if he's able to test his chin, if he's able to knock him on his ass, because I don't feel like this fight is going to finish in the distance. I feel like this fight is going to go the entire 5 rounds, and I feel like if Jorge Masvidal is going to win the majority of the rounds, it will be by hurting Nate Diaz, putting him on his ass, doing the more eye-catching work, and winning the rounds in the books of the judges. Nate Diaz, on the other hand, I feel like he's going to try and implement the same sort of game plan he did against Donald Cerrone with the boxing, but also he's going to try and outstrong Jorge Masvidal the same way he did with Pettis. Let's not forget, Jorge Masvidal hasn't always been a career 170 pounder himself, and I feel like Nate Diaz may have the physical strength advantage, and if he's able to grab a hold of Jorge Masvidal, push him up against that cage and control his upper body the same way he did with Pettis, I think he'll be able to drag Jorge Masvidal into deep waters, into rounds 3, 4 and 5, and maybe sap some of that energy away and just take the fight away from him. With all that being said, I'm literally 50-50. I'm torn on this fight. I don't know who's going to fucking win. Obviously I don't know who's going to win, but I don't even feel like I have a good idea. Like, if I was to bet on this, it'd literally be a coin flip. But because I'm doing this video, I'm going to make a prediction, and I don't know if Jorge Masvidal has the power to hurt Nate Diaz the same way he did to Darren Till, the same way he did to Ben Askren. I feel like the way he knocked both of them out is because those 2 opponents got reckless and he took advantage of it. I don't feel like Nate Diaz is the kind of guy that's going to get reckless. I feel like he's way more intelligent than people give him credit for, and I feel like he will maintain his composure, or keep his wits about him enough to not get caught with a shot that he didn't see coming, because those are the ones that knock you out at the end of the day. I feel like Nate Diaz will shave this. I feel like he'll probably win 3 rounds to 2, maybe 4 rounds to 1. Having said that, the untangible, the one thing that I don't know and I'm not sure about is whether Jorge Masvidal, because let's be fair, he's knocked out his last 2 opponents, and these were guys that he was supposed to lose to. Maybe he has just got better power. Maybe this new aggressive side of him enables him to hit harder. I don't know, but I'm putting my money on the fact that he won't be able to knock Nate Diaz out, and if that's the case, I feel like Nate Diaz will win this on points. But if he's able to hurt Nate Diaz, if he's able to put him on his ass, 2 or 3 times throughout the fight, he might nick those rounds, so he may win on points. But I'm not backing that. I think Nate Diaz will win this fight on points. But either way, here's a cliche for you lot. I think the real winners are going to be us, because I think this will be a contender for Fight of the Year. Yeah, that's my prediction. Let me know what you guys think. Put your comments below. Don't be scared to hit the like button if you haven't already. Please subscribe, because I've been talking to you lot for nearly 15 minutes. And if you haven't subscribed, I don't know what you're waiting for. If you've enjoyed this, share it with a friend. And yeah, I'll catch you guys on the next one.